Okay, great, everyone. I think some people have signed on, so we can start. My name is Kerry Brown. I'm director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, and it's a great honour today to have Daniel Vukovich from the University of Hong Kong in the Comparative Literature and School of Humanities, where he's been since 2006. This is going to be a discussion around his third book that's just been published, After Autonomy, a post-mortem of Hong Kong's first handover from 1997. Daniel will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes about the book, which he'll be able to give more details about and how to get it. And then our colleague Xin Fan from the University of Cambridge, who has written extensively on China's and global history. He's published a book a year or so ago, which he might want to say a bit about, which he launched a couple of years ago with us. We'll engage with Daniel, and then we will have hopefully discussion questions from people participating. So if I could invite Daniel to speak now and hand over to him. Daniel, please feel free to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kerry. Also for hosting me and organizing all of this. So let me share a screen real quick. It's just my kind of outline. I think everyone can see that. So yeah, great. Start my timer as well. I don't want to go on too long. So as Kerry mentioned, this is my third book, and I had originally had the title in my head for some time called After Autonomy, and I had conceived it as I work in cultural studies and post-colonial studies, basically primarily with kind of a leg or at least a foot or so in China studies as well. So I'm trying to kind of bring cultural theory to questions of representation of China, China-West relationship, so on. So my second book was called Illiberal China, and it also had a chapter on Hong Kong and the then very hot topic of the Occupy movement there. And I was still kind of strongly motivated by that, and also by the place and interesting kind of problem and figure of Hong Kong. So I wanted to do something on called After Autonomy that looked at the kind of ideal of autonomy within our kind of received political theory, so much critical theory and kind of values, as well as, of course, liberalism and things like that, and what that really meant today in this kind of period of intense globalization of the past couple, 3 decades at least, right? But then the protest movement erupted of 2019, and I realized, while I was still going to talk about Hong Kong anyway, and the other one, I really needed to engage this because it was such a kind of, I think, momentous event. And yeah, so I kind of had to delve into that. And so the first part of this book offers a kind of alternative account of the movement or the event in Hong Kong. Not trying to be objective and not necessarily trying to be exhaustive either, but trying to take it seriously, and also trying to kind of offer a different narrative and a different kind of analysis of that event than was common at the time or even in the aftermath since, right? And in some ways, the kind of expert commentary, academic study of it as it was happening and in the year or so afterwards really kind of, to me, kind of reproduced the media discourse, right? And the event itself was so kind of strongly driven by what I refer to as mediatization, a term from communication studies, which basically talks about how the power of the media as a kind of fifth estate can really kind of not just, of course, represent, but kind of influence and dictate, maybe even change the flow of events, and that kind of stuff, right? So I was trying to look at it and present a kind of different account, at least from my own perspective, that veered away from the kind of template of authoritarianism versus freedom, or a kind of imperialist plot in an almost conspiracy sense, versus other accounts which, like the movement, offering it as a kind of somehow mysteriously or radically theoretical event or something like that, right? Yeah, and as a scholar of post-colonial studies, of course, Hong Kong and this event in general, immediately seemed to be something that was quite crucial to me, right, into the event. Yeah, so that's the first part of the book on that. I think within this, so we're going to focus today a little bit more on the question of colonialism or decolonization and its relation to that movement. From that first part, I would just bring up something I've already kind of touched on, which is just that it's very tempting, and it's not without foundation entirely, to read that as a kind of attempted or failed color revolution within Hong Kong, right? And so a lot of the mainland media and kind of take on it was essentially that, which is, of course, in some ways, fairly kind of predictable, right? And I think that what I'm trying to do here is to say that, no, basically 2019 and before and after it, very much a homegrown Hong Kong problem, Hong Kong issue, or a Hong Kong and China problem and issue. And so that other kind of theater, the other actors of it, particularly the United States or the West getting involved in it, is very real, and it comes into play, and it even has maybe a powerful influence in the outcome of it eventually. But it was more than that, right? So that we've come to see some of the funding from like the National Endowment for Democracy and other places going into it, some of the kind of tutelage of the movement from Oslo Foundation, human rights organizations, et cetera. That's all very real, but it doesn't really help us explain or fully kind of understand why that event happened, the kind of forms it took, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that if you were to look at, if you want to call it imperialist in some sense, the imperialist angle or aspect of that movement that's underappreciated would probably just be that power and influence of the media basically around it. And it's the fact that it was so live streamed and broadcasted almost live practically throughout it, right? And that had consequences, right? And I think that's even kind of what enables people to go and kind of solicit American representatives and eventually legislation, et cetera, on that movement, which I think was basically the kind of final straw of the movement, and which in effect kind of ushered in that new national security law or kind of legislation from that. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Okay. So yeah, that's a good part of the book. Other parts of this, I won't try to go over all of this in the time that's left here. But some other, I think, key issues to talk about within the event itself and in general for Hong Kong and Hong Kong, China, is the basic law itself and the basic law system, right? And I think we need to really kind of understand this, or how it's used, or how it's become a kind of token, so to speak, within the city and its politics, much more than anything else. So it's really kind of fundamental to do that. Although on the other hand, I'm also tempted to say that we need to see it also as basically a kind of expedient political compromise. I mean, it's a document that came to serve as a mini constitution and blueprint, but isn't really one of those, right? So that we still need to see it as a kind of treatise, and there's a kind of larger theater going on there, right? So at any rate, to delve into it a little bit, and I do it in the other book as well to some extent, but a lot of the maybe confusion or problems or contradictions within that, the basic law, have to do really with the two systems aspect of it, right? So it's one country, two systems is a kind of slogan for this, right? The system is specifically Hong Kong capitalism is system one, and then Chinese socialism is system number two. This is how it's formulated in the 80s. Okay, and I've drawn on the work of Lau China and a couple other people on this question of the basic law and what was happening in the 80s when this was being drafted. And really the main discussion or concern at the time, at least among within the drafters, was this question of the two systems, right? But, there's such a big difference between the early 80s, or 83, 84, this is finally ratified, and then 97, right? So whatever you want to make of the claim that China's, socialist system in the early 80s, by 97, it's clearly a different system, or that system has changed regardless of what we want to call it, okay? So there's no longer, I think by 97 even, certainly by 2007, certainly by 2017, and up to today, right? it's kind of a non-starter to think you have two systems that you can keep separate and therefore kind of guarantee the autonomy of Hong Kong, right? Whether you call it capitalism, socialism, varieties of capitalism is less important. That in a way it's one system or one economy, right? Which cannot be kind of neatly parceled out and separated, although the rhetoric and pretense has been that they are in many ways, right? So I think that that's one of the main contradictions of the whole arrangement since then. The document also says nothing in particular about colonialism, which I'll get to in a second. What the real fights or struggles have been about that, and this is probably familiar to many people here, given the ambiguities of it around this one system or two systems, have been around the two articles, right? So you have the article over national security 23, which is what the mainland wanted and tried to get on board early on in the handover period, but which didn't go, was immediately resisted, right? But which is in the basic law, saying they need to do that. And then the article basically dictating suffrage, which is Article 43, meaning election, right? And I quote these at length in the book and try to unpack them, and I won't do that here. But, you know, basically, in short, you have within the kind of pan-democratic movement and within those people who understood the basic law in this 50-year period as being basically about preserving and ensuring and keeping a high degree of autonomy, as it says, but which really I think came to meant to them almost de facto full autonomy from China, right? So you kind of have like a political allegiance or something like that, right? You're certainly not trying to be independent, but in every other way, you kind of ideally or should be kind of autonomous from it, okay? So there's that kind of interpretation or leaning into that particular reading of the basic law, saying this is really the basis of it from one side, and then from the mainland side, which in a way might matter less because it's not in Hong Kong, but in another way matters a whole lot because they kind of control the sovereignty, they are sovereign. It's that national security one, right? So it basically was understood as being autonomy, almost a full autonomy, and then the other side seeing that basically this is a period of integration, right? And it kind of slow but sure integration, okay? And I think this was a kind of split that was quite fundamental, and you didn't really see it budge, certainly in the time since I've been here, since 2006, but not really budging since 97, okay? And so Occupy Central 2014 was kind of almost like the denouement of this kind of status quo or stagnation where both sides are dug in and they're not really budging, right? And then with Occupy kind of failing to result in suffrage, and then the pan-democrats rejecting a reform election package, there's a great deal of frustration, particularly I think among the younger activists and youth within that Occupy movement, that ends up turning more militant, but not just more militant about suffrage, really kind of, you have to see a kind of explosion of a kind of nativistic and kind of xenophobic identity in Hong Kong. That's which I'll get back to a little bit, this question of identity, but it really kind of takes legs and kind of explodes. So that another thing I talk about in the book briefly, but I think crucially, is the Mongkok fishball revolution, which of course none of these are really revolutions in like the Maoist or, you know, Soviet sense or something like that. But anyway, which was a protest and it kind of turned into a riot, and it wasn't nearly as big as these other ones, but it really represented a kind of break from the kind of non-violent resistance. So there was like brick throwing there on the part of protesters, and the police are kind of told to absorb this at first, and then they strike back. So it gets a little violent. It's gone from just tear gas to like bricks and violence, and an expression of not just like nativism, which interestingly is directed, kind of scapegoating the police as almost as if they're mainland agents, but also like pro-independence and separatist, right? So that becomes something that actually exists a little bit before 2014 as well, but starts to really kind of flower, if you will, after that, and really kind of culminates in 2019. Yeah, so Yeah, there's a number of contradictions, I think, in the basic law, but one way we could, and I talk about them, but essentially it becomes less about the truth of the document and one side betraying it and one having the real correct interpretation and not, right? But essentially a kind of political power struggle over the meaning of this text, where the text itself kind of gets left behind, and ultimately the kind of mainland side wins this, right? Because they actually had the sovereignty all along and the capacity to do this if they had to or chose to, which they basically have. Okay. So yeah, from this, let me get more into the colonial and decolonial aspects of it. So I would say that the rise of this kind of nativist and xenophobic identity within Hong Kong, which is not all Hong Kong people, of course, and it's not the only Hong Kong identity, but it's the one that really mattered in 2019 in terms of the consequences and the kind of direction of the movement by the end of that summer. That clearly has to do with a unique kind of Hong Kong history that's also rooted in its kind of colonial period or past as well, right? So as other scholars have talked about, you have a rise, I guess I'm jumping down the identity part here. You have a rise of a localist kind of place-based Hong Kong identity in, let's say, the 70s, where this is actually kind of endorsed and even promulgated a bit by the government through like literary festivals and so on and things like that, where it becomes a thing to have a like place-based Hong Konger identity, its own kind of culture, identity, et cetera, and a kind of, more importantly, a kind of recognition or calling of it as that, right? Partly as a result of the Cultural Revolution and some of the discontent in Hong Kong as well, right? But between the 70s and 2019, a lot happens, of course. And really from 2014 to 19, that local place-based one kind of, as I said, gets more nativistic and xenophobic, which has often been a kind of unfortunate part of anti-colonial or even part of colonialism, I suppose, but also kind of got to be a part of some of these movements and resistance against kind of former colonial powers, okay? Yeah, so that's absolutely something that happened there. In terms of the kind of way forward, the terms of what paths a kind of decolonization or decolonial forms that Hong Kong might take, because they haven't really started to happen enough. Okay, and part of my point is really that 2019 shows us this, right? I think it will be the development of other forms of like kind of place-based local Hong Kong identity. It would be a misnomer to think that there's just going to be a direct imposition of a mainland identity, as if that was some monolithic thing to begin with, right? So I don't quite know what those will be, but I'm quite sure they'll happen because identities are kind of fluid and changing over time. Not like changing your clothes, but they do change. And I think they will kind of evolve and move that way here in Hong Kong in some ways. I don't, and I think there's even a space for the state, if I can put it that way, or the government, certainly the civil society, educators, et cetera, to do something, not to like necessarily promulgate a specific identity, but to do things that help kind of seed the ground for a more kind of pluralistic and different one, right? Because they're going to be taken up differently by individuals anyway, right? But I think there will be a space of that. So it's not like the death of Hong Kong, it's going to be the rebirth and greater power or valence of particular other Hong Kong identities, now that this one is basically finished. I mean, it's politically repressed too. You can't, people can still feel that way, but you can't act on it, right? There's that kind of red line. Okay, so that's one part of it. Yeah, just a couple of minutes, but I can do this part a little more quickly. I think the other areas where you can see a kind of impact of colonialism or the colonial period and paths forward or areas for decolonization that haven't been hit by the basic law or really kind of developed enough are multiple. One, there's the economic one, which is, within post-colonial studies, we haven't really given enough weight to the question of economic decolonization and what that might mean. You can get obsessed with the question of political sovereignty and just literally who's in power, something like that, or cultural questions of colonization and decolonization. But the economic one is really quite important, not necessarily more important, although you could argue it is, but there needs to be some of that. And so I think, and you can see it, at least rhetorically, Hong Kong's heritage of a kind of classical, and I'm going to stereotype this, but a kind of classical British liberalism, economic and political for that matter, but economic kind of laissez-faire liberalism has been what's really defined the city, although it hasn't always followed that formula either, right? That's really been its kind of governing ideology, its kind of official intellectual and political culture, right? I think that's going to start to give way, right? Which doesn't mean they're going to be a bunch of communists and socialists and something like that now. Well, that would be interesting to see. But that you've seen the limits with that protest, I think, or the conditions that led to it, a kind of economic precarity, particularly among the youth, who are facing kind of either jobless futures or unpleasant ones economically, cost of housing, all the stuff that's really quite familiar. Okay. I think there's a recognition that that was really part of the problem, not just by people like us who are academics, kind of know such things, but you even see it by officials, right? So the finance secretary here some years ago talked about like people's livelihood and needing to not only grow, but to, I forget how we put it exactly, divide the cake better, something like that, right? But a good point nonetheless, right? That's unique in Hong Kong, and certainly since I've been here, where we have not seen this kind of thing being voiced. So you see kind of trickle down, if you will, of a kind of Xi Jinping people's livelihood rhetoric, and maybe a more cognizance that the government has a responsibility as a state to improve livelihood, right? Albeit through the market, through development, this kind of stuff. But that, I think, is a step forward, would represent some form of decolonization or progress or partial decolonization, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. The other thing would be a question of, there's many things here too, but the other thing, because I draw attention to it in the last part of the book, it's probably a kind of thing that's often on people's mind, is this question of political decolonization. So it seems to me that the handover regime, whatever you want to call it, the government after the handover, it inherited a lack of state capacity. In other words, you had the weak state, small state, big market thing, right? You had a lack of a state capacity, even probably initially in some ways, a lack of a desire to have a state capacity, perhaps, right? Although Teng Chi-Wa, the first CE, was perhaps different, but he didn't last too long because of the national security issue. Anyway, a lack of that kind of organizational capacity, which was really exposed to me, and I think to others, was already kind of evident with the lack of enough investment in like education and hospitals and things like that, and public housing and things like that. But also with the Omicron wave of that last wave of the pandemic, right? Hong Kong did well in some ways, did poorly in other ways, but I think by the end of it, it was starting to try to find and develop and exercise a capacity to deal with it a little bit like the mainland might be able to, right? In terms of mobilizing resources and things like that. So there's a learning curve there, but it kind of exposed the lack of that capacity. And then the other thing that it has lacked historically, and I'm not the only person to say this, is that, you know, if you have a politically or kind of underdeveloped or weak state as a result of the colonial period, you also had, in the case of Hong Kong, a lack of a political class, right? Because it was governed essentially by bureaucrats, right? You didn't have like politicians per se. So it's been a struggle to find a kind of functional political class that could actually rule Hong Kong effectively, right? Or more effectively. And that's not to disparage the other people, everybody in the government or something like that, but it just seems to me powerfully true that there was no experience for that, and they're not really politicians, right? So that for these reasons, Hong Kong, ironically, has not been able to benefit nearly as much as it should have from this growing expansion and the quote unquote miracle or boom of China since the 90s or since 97, right? It's been integrating, but not in a very planned way, not in a very conscious way, not in a way that benefits as many people as it could, even within kind of developmental capitalist terms, right? So it will need to develop this kind of political class as well. There's a certain learning curve and ability that goes with that, right? So I don't know how that will go, but certainly between the reforms to the LegCo, which might seem like a disaster in some ways, but in other ways have at least enabled, and other ways can seem like to be honest, quite a big improvement, because legislation is finally able to get passed now, right? Even stuff that's like uncontroversial legislation, that's not necessarily directly political or debatable controversial things, is able to get done more, right? So we shall see. I mean, one of the phrases I keep putting in the book is "we shall see" as it goes forward here in the second handover, right? But I think that there will finally be a reckoning, or there has to be a reckoning, with some of the inheritances from that colonial period into Hong Kong, which would actually make it move into a more post-colonial or, if you will, progressive era or mode, right? So that's actually 24 minutes on this now. So I've gone over a little bit, but I want to wrap it up here and have more time for the conversation. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'll stop the
Thank
share.
you, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah.
So now if I can invite Xin Fan to say some words. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the conversation. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here. A couple of years ago, I had the pleasure to present my own book with the Lau Center, invited by Professor Kerry Brown. It's a pleasure. It's a very nice feeling to visit back after 2 years. And I had the pleasure to read Dr. Daniel Vukovich's book. I'm very much impressed. And I'm saying so from two perspectives. One is I'm a historian, and the book I wrote was about world history in China. So in a way, I was trained to talk about what happened in the past. And never one day, right, do I feel comfortable to talk about things that are happening today in this world. And this is the reason that the history profession, right, we're holding our professional values, but at the same time, we're losing grounds, because oftentimes, right, people are asking, what's your opinion about what's going on in this world? What's really happening? And this is the reason I admire Dr. Vukovich's book and his effort, because he's writing about an event that is, in a way, still ongoing, right? In his book, he's talking about what happened in 1997, and then what happened in 2014, 2017, 2019, and pandemic, COVID times, and post-COVID times. So he's writing really what's happening in this world. Not only he's doing that, but also he's theorizing everything. And he's placing with what's happening within the context of decolonization and the reshuffling of the relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland in this world today. It's amazing, right? I learned a lot. And from a historian's perspective, I have this feeling that is, what I'm reading now is a piece of historical document. Because I assume years later, right, when people are writing the history of Hong Kong in the second decade of the 21st century, they would probably read his book again. And based on this book, they probably will write an interesting story about this changing world. So I'm very impressed. I'm really, really impressed. I learned a lot. And of course, as for this book's argument, I'm intrigued by Dr. Vukovich's call for integration of Hong Kong into mainland China through an active process of political engagement, which he called decolonization. To me, this process is fundamentally a social and political effort to expand state capacity in this special region with a goal to ultimately transform this laissez-faire economy into a social welfare state. That's what I feel, right? It's a call from this book. And I have no expertise in judging whether or not what he proposes is a viable solution to the old problems in Hong Kong. But I do agree, whatever they are, they ought to be both political and economic. And we must address these issues before and perhaps after we deal with ideological issues. And speaking about the political, here are my 3 questions for Dr. Vukovich. First one, you mentioned the politics and the depoliticization quite a few times in the book. They seem to be central to the conceptual framework of the book and your thesis. I was wondering how you define the meaning of being political. For people who are less familiar with history of political thought, the concept of the political has been a highly controversial question. As some people stress the antagonistic nature of the political process as Mao's class struggle and cultural revolution, others often adopt a more liberal interpretation of the idea of the political and bringing the conversation into everyday practice. So, Dr. Vukovich, would you be willing to tell us about your working definition of the political in this book? Is the politics in this book just about voting, striking, and protesting? What else does it include? What does the political in Hong Kong mean? Is that special or universal? This is my first question. And the second question, as I mentioned before, as historians, we write about the things that have happened. But in this book, Dr. Vukovich writes about things that are happening. I'm particularly struck by your use of event in the title of the first chapter, which is in the event, the politics and the context of the 2019 anti-ELAB protests. Some of our academic audiences might know that the term event is a loaded one. What is an event? When did it start? And when was it over? Those questions trouble historians a lot, where we're struggling. In this book, Dr. Vukovich, it seemed to me you're connecting various dots in historical moments and reshuffle them into new narrative and a new chronology. So for example, right, you connect 2019 to the fishbowl revolutions in 2017, instead of the umbrella movement of 2014. So how do you define an event? Why do you choose such a definition? By connecting dots in historical time, to what extent are you telling us a new story? Also, you're writing about the anti-ELAB protests. Are you still writing about it in the event, or is it over? And the last question I'm going to ask is about identity. And you mentioned that a lot in your presentation. I appreciate it a lot. And you're a post-colonial cultural critique, if I may call you that way. And you argue Hong Kong identity, in the book, you wrote about Hong Kong identity is constantly changing. And the changeability is in its root. Therefore, it demands an active and perhaps a positive process of identity formation. And even perhaps with state intervention, such as the history education you discussed in the last chapter of the book. But to what extent is identity also resilient? Isn't the fear of change part of our human nature as well? Well, we acknowledge the contingent aspect of it. isn't it the reason that we invent the term identity is to stress continuity? So from this perspective, can we and shall we appreciate the fear and the anxiety that are deeply rooted in the changing society? Shall they be part of the identity formation process in the post-COVID Hong Kong? These are my questions. These questions are from my shallow reading of your book. I'm a historian again, right? I am not theorize as well as you do, but I would love your thoughts on this question. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Before you, Daniel, do that, as you were speaking, I wanted to share with you. I'm just going to share you. Is it? Here it is. Okay. Digging through the archives, and this is the record of the meeting between Margaret Thatcher and Mr. Deng Xiaoping in 1982, where they talked for the first time about sovereignty. As you remember, the island of Hong Kong was on a perpetual, kind of, what do you call it? I mean, it was granted to in perpetuity in the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, as were the Kowloon was 1860, that was in perpetuity. But 97% of the territory, the new territories, was on a 99 years. And the original idea in the early 1980s was, that Thatcher, having just won the Falklands War, was very keen that Britain would come up with a deal where we would continue to manage Hong Kong after 1997. In this meeting, which is the first time that she met Deng Xiaoping, it kind of begins with this very strange, if you look at the beginning, it has this thing about Mr. Deng said that he read the minutes, and then he invited Margaret Thatcher to speak, which was obviously a very brave thing, because once she started, she wouldn't stop. She kept on talking about this idea of sovereignty. And you'll see this sort of section here, interjecting at this point. Mr. Deng Xiaoping asked what the Prime Minister meant by control. And then he asked later whether control meant rule of a place by a country. And that's where things got really sticky, because she sort of alluded to the idea that, sovereignty could be fudged, but Britain would carry on having some kind of role. This is a publicly available document now, it's been declassified. But the thing that I'm interested in is when he kind of says later, when it gets really, really kind of difficult, and it was a famously bad-tempered meeting. He sort of basically said, there's no deal on sovereignty, right? We're just not going to sovereignty is everything else we can talk about, but sovereignty is completely unnegotiable. And if you think, we're going to just step aside and let you carry on after 1997, or even before, if you start kind of questioning our right to have sovereignty back, then we're going to basically, we're going to actually go in even beforehand. We're going to get involved beforehand. I mean, it seems to me, so, I'm happy to send this document to anyone who's interested. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating encounter. But the thing that I guess I'm sort of, because of an awareness of that history, and as an historian, you'd be very aware of this. I guess that's always haunted this issue, that, actually, it's a very big irony that the Qing dynasty, for instance, didn't really have a kind of notion of sovereignty that the British in the 19th century could respond to. I mean, for them, sovereignty was a Westphalian idea, and for the Qing, it was more complex ideas of suzerainty and stuff like that. And it seems really weird that, at the very end of this colonizing period, the British should sort of want to kind of fudge the issue of sovereignty and shift to something like, more flexible, where they could manage a territory, but China would have a sort of, sovereignty, but it would really be, under British management. And how surprised Britain was that China was so adamant about sovereignty and the meaning of sovereignty. And I found that a really helpful thing in understanding the situation of Hong Kong today, because I mean, and it'd be good to hear your thoughts on this, looking at the response in Britain to what has happened in Hong Kong in the last few years, for all of the justifiable concern. I don't think we still quite get what sovereignty means for Beijing and China. We don't quite understand. And in a lot of the documents from the 1980s, preliminary to Thatcher's meeting, all of the things are about economic, viability, legal viability, sustainability of the system. None really refer to the importance of the Chinese, of sovereignty and of control. And I'm really curious as to why today we still kind of don't really understand that. I guess my point is that in all of the issues that have happened in Hong Kong up until today, while we can be very critical about the management, the way that the central government has handled things, we still kind of have this great, as British people, but maybe also as Americans and others, we have this great flexibility about being on about other people's sovereignty. But we definitely don't like people banging on about our sovereignty. And just finally, one of the big ironies is at the very moment when Thatcher was going to Beijing and saying to China, be flexible about sovereignty, she was definitely not flexible about sovereignty in Northern Ireland, where when the Irish government in Southern Ireland said, well, look, let's have shared sovereignty for Northern Ireland, she went completely nuts. So one country, two systems was fine for China, but it definitely wasn't fine for Britain. So I think that's a kind of way of framing this. For people who are participating, if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we've already got a couple, but I'll let Daniel respond to Xin's points, and then if he wishes to, he might respond to the one I've just made, but then I'll go on to the Q&A. So Daniel, yeah.
Yeah, unmute. Oh, thank you, Kerry. Actually, that's a great, I appreciate the document. I'd love to see that. I think that's a great reminder and not just anecdote, but little case study almost of what this issue is with that. And I think you're right that it's astounding, right? Because not just Britain or the UK, whatever I'm supposed to say, but the States as well. If you were to say, well, Alaska, Hawaii, this should not really be under American United States sovereignty in a way. Like there's clearly was a, theft there and the whole history of expansion and all that kind of stuff within its own borders, kind of stuff, right? But it's always like other people's sovereignties, and I think you're right. People don't fully appreciate the Chinese understanding of sovereignty or control, and that they really mean it. Not in this sense much dissimilar to other places with their own territory as well, right? So the idea that they would just let it go or something like that, or that this wouldn't at the end really bother them, right? That people are going and to Washington, D.C. and soliciting help, and people openly calling for this. Not that it was ever really going to happen. It was not going to. I mean, at some level it was theater, but another level was also very real, right? So yeah, I think there's definitely a kind of failure to kind of appreciate that. Yeah, what that really means, right? I mean, it's similar with, as you see it all the time, like, well, because the government and the state uses it as part of their official rhetoric of, the 150 years, is that right? The era of national humiliation of China by the foreign powers, that people want to say, well, so long ago, why don't you get over it? It wasn't so long ago, actually, historically speaking, and certainly not from their perspective, right? So it's like, well, that's kind of why, right? I mean, yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, it's really something. Let me segue to Xin's comments, which I am very grateful for. Let me see if I can at least get through a couple of them here. The question of how you would define the political in this, I mean, it is an open question, and it's not like scientific, I would insist, right, as a kind of humanities person. So I'm not that I have like the best objective definition of it, but what I've come back to after many, and I'm still in there, but many years of like cultural theory and things like that, is in some ways a very traditional notion of the political, although now rediscovered through people, for me, relatively new in my lifetime, I suppose, like reading Mao closely and seriously, or like Carl Schmitt, as problematic as he definitely is to say the least, as you know, the crown jurist of the Nazi Party. Question of his notion of definition of the political, which have been influential in a number of fields and which are kind of interesting. Even if you don't agree, you got to read these people. Traditional meaning that, first of all, I think it has to be about the state and actually government, right? And when it's a kind of struggle for that, right? So, you know, there's one stream of thought defining the political, which will be anti-state, period. Either through a kind of British liberal perspective of laissez-faire, or like Nietzsche or something, or the kind of libertarian anarchistic strains with like within French post-structuralism and things like that too. You got to get this anti-state perspective, which is also in my American context so powerful, right, after the 60s and 70s in particular. So I want to react against that and go back to the definition of the political being about the state, exercise of state capacity, contestation over who controls the state, why you would want to struggle for it, etc. So to me, I even mean that in a very old-fashioned sense, but I think that politics has to be about that, right? So that when there are certain demands, this is, I realize, a tricky issue, but when you're demanding something that's impossible, so to speak, like universal suffrage, meaning only impossible in terms of the basic law, which doesn't quite stipulate it, or realistically, pragmatically speaking, that kind of stuff, then I don't want to say it's not political, but I want to say it's at least kind of problematic, right? Because even for that, how would you put it? You would still have to be contesting over the state much more directly, if I can put it that way. So for me, it tends to understanding the politics and the political goes around the state and actual governance. Not that, you know, there's a strain of thought that says, you know, everything is political. But if everything is political, then kind of nothing is, right? You could say the personal is political, and I would absolutely agree with that. But that by itself doesn't tell you what is political about that which is personal, right? It has to be that connection to the state or to kind of questions of power, I think, right? Things like that. So I would do that. And then the other way I look at it is invoked earlier, like this kind of friend-enemy antagonism or kind of dyad. And you get a point where there are, unfortunately, I'm not endorsing this, and I don't know if it's like a universal thing or if it's, I don't want to be like spiritual or transcendent about it, but you get these irreconcilable struggles or splits or camps. And there's just this conflict, and one side has to win or one side has to lose, right? And so I think one way to look at what was happening in Hong Kong, the tussle over what the meaning of the basic law was, is it Article 23, or was it, I say 45? I'm always getting my numbers wrong. Suffrage or security or this or that. Does suffrage not contradict the selection committee, which is also stipulated? All these kind of battles over that. Really what that was a kind of, not necessarily even consciously to the actors themselves, a kind of friend-enemy of deep-rooted antagonism that was fundamentally political. And in some ways, this was just not resolvable, right? Until one side wins, right? So to speak. So I think that's part of what the game is with that. I don't want to take up all the time on that, but let me go to the question of the event, and really great question. Thank you. Oh, and the question of identity on that. Those are really good ones. I think for the event, I think you're right. I think basically, it's just that I don't think it's not, as you would know, I think as a kind of nuanced and kind of intellectual historian, it's not that it just begins and ends and then it's over, right? There is something that keeps going. That's kind of what you would define it. So I'm not trying to make too much out of this, but I think that it's truly not just a protest movement, but an event in the sense that it represents a kind of crystallization. It seems to come out of nowhere, but of course doesn't, over previous decades, struggles, contradictions going on in Hong Kong, and that are momentous enough that it really has these kind of major consequences. So that was an event, certainly by its scale and how many people were involved and things like that, but also because of the passage of the national security law and basically everything else that was entailed by that, right? So not only the arrests or crackdown, how do you say, that many of the people involved, but appending the basic law, changing the LegCo system, et cetera. There's a way in which it was clear Hong Kong is never going to be the same, and it's never going to be the same because of 2019. But 2019 is not just those 5 months, it's also, I think, the whole previous period leading up into it. So I think we're still in that moment in some sense. Yeah, and then we'd have to figure in the pandemic as well and how this has changed so many things. And then last but not least, I think your question around identity and fear is a really good one. One of the things I'm teaching this semester, I teach a little classical modern political theory as for literature students kind of thing. But we read a little bit of Machiavelli, we read Hobbes, who, speaking of sovereignty and the British tradition, like Hobbes would be a nice voice to maybe remind people of like how absolute he is about that control. But yeah, I think that, yeah, fear is, if not part of human nature, very primal. Yeah, part of human nature in some sense, depending on how to define that. And I think that that's also what animated so much of the desperation among many folks in 2019, right? There really is genuinely this fear among, and I'm not saying it's true, I'm just saying the perception is there. And it's not based on nothing either, but that Hong Kong is dying, or this is the last stand, right? That this kind of the Lam Tsao Burnism ethos or rhetoric of that movement, if you really sit down and think about it, is quite scary for what it says and like what people are willing to do, I suppose, but also about like what happens such that this becomes something that becomes possible and available for people to take up psychologically and mentally and internally, right? There's something wrong if you get to that point. And that's a responsibility for the people who rule Hong Kong and not just the people in the streets feeling it kind of thing, right? So I think that, yeah, it's something that, but actually the point you raised, I think very nicely with this too, is Hong Kong as identity is changing and always changing and things like that, that from Akbar Abbas and other people who talk about not just Hong Kong identity, but identity. You're right that there's, what about continuity? I think there are people who want a kind of stable and secure one too. If that's, I mean, I think that's one of the things that came to my mind when you were doing that, like that want to stress continuity, and it's this constant change that bothers them. Yeah, and I think that is definitely something that's operative. But the only solution to that would be to somehow ameliorate this fear, ameliorate the pace of change or the experience of what that is with people, which for me will go back to the need for kind of economic livelihood and improvement in Hong Kong in some ways, and other factors as well. But yeah, maybe stop on that. Yeah.
Great. So we have some questions in the Q&A. The first is, are you seeing 2019, 2020 as a second handover? And how do you see it as different from the first handover in 1997 or the colonial period before 1997? It's a very broad question. So that's the first one. And then the second question, there are some who see Hong Kong as not decolonized, but recolonized by China. How do you situate Hong Kong in the decolonial narrative? So if I let you answer those are two big questions. So I'll let you answer those, and then we'll move to the other ones. Yeah, and as I say, anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
Okay, second handover. Second handover in the sense that the political structure, even I mentioned like the appendices now to the basic law giving the national security legislation or the national security law and other changes to ledge code, things like that, have themselves in some ways initiated a second period of a handover. But my other point is that I think it's over that first handover because of what it led to. And you had this period where the Pan-Democrats really did have an effective hegemony, which was hard earned, by the way. I mean, they were often getting voted in. They were strong in their own right across this and across civil society, et cetera. But it led to this kind of political stagnation. And there did basically become a showdown between this camp and the other, as I was just kind of saying. And that's what kind of switched it. So yeah, I think that's different from the 97 one. Yeah. Oh, let me say, I kind of lost the first one up there already, but the second question was
there are some who see Hong Kong. There are some who see Hong Kong as not decolonized,
oh, I got
recolonized by China. So how do you situate in that narrative?
Yeah. The idea that Hong Kong, this kind of cultural studies thing, which I don't particularly agree with, but it's influential. So maybe I'm the wrong one. But it's always said that, Hong Kong is between two colonizers, at its moment of handover and presumably up to the present, between that of the British and then that of the mainland, right? And it kind of would follow from that then that it's being recolonized. And that really was a live rhetoric, and it wasn't something that was just from academe. There's something either trickle down or trickle up. I'm not sure which direction it worked. People who would voice that or see that or frame China as an invader or colonizer, things like that. That partly has to do with the kind of unregulated or not sufficiently regulated amount of tourism and migration in and things like that, and scarcity in Hong Kong and so on. But I'm not particularly persuaded by it, basically, because I think that the sovereignty question, even though you can make too much out of sovereignty for defining colonialism, it's nonetheless kind of indispensable to define what colonial is or is not, right? And in this case, the sovereignty of Hong Kong or over Hong Kong and part of the mainland is just, to me, just kind of clear, right? So you don't need to revert to a language of colonialism to object to or find fault with what's going on in Hong Kong vis-a-vis mainland policies or the lack thereof of those policies, right? So I don't think it's a recolonization. If you want to argue that in some ways it's still colonial for one reason or another, that's a different argument. Yeah.
Thank you. So, and then we have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
From Wayne Hart, what do you see as the most weighty variable or variables behind the ambivalence Hong Kong as a feeling between identification with Hong Kongese or Hong Kongness and identification with Chineseness? And maybe Xin Fan, you might want to comment on this one if you see any kind of variables. And then the second one is quite a long one. So, is the reason the UK-US crusade for democracy in places like Hong Kong, so that is it that they can influence that country or territory, i.e. fund and give media support for certain parties? Linked to Hong Kong, is it true that the British only introduced democratic reform when a handover of the territory back to China was agreed? Democracy was okay when under control, but when ceding control, Britain wanted to introduce democracy. Well, I can answer that one. Okay, I can answer that one. It is true that there was an attempt in 1945 by the governor then, Hong Kong was occupied by the Japanese from I think 1941 or 42. And once the Second World War was over, of course, there was an enormous issue between, it wasn't Roosevelt, it was Truman, wasn't it? Wasn't it Truman, the American president at the end of the Second World War? Anyway, the American president didn't think it was a great idea for Britain to reacquire its colonies. And Hong Kong was therefore, momentarily going to sort of be reappropriated by the Republic of China. However, a deal was done where colonial rule continued, but the governor at the time, whose name escapes me, did want some democratic reform. That wasn't possible. It was blocked by business interest in the city, and therefore that was shelved and it never really reappeared. It is true until the 1980s. There were no real reforms of popular participation. I mean, as Daniel knows, there was sort of minimal kind of involvement in the Legislative Council, but it was not representative democracy at all. This question of whether Britain, it's a huge question, because in fact, in the 80s, it really didn't figure. But Chris Patten, when he became the final governor in 1992, really concentrated on how the basic law and the Sino-British Agreement of 84 did give space to have more representation. It's a complicated issue. To be honest, no one comes out of it very well, because it is absolutely true the British did not introduce democratic institutions in the colony until, or it wasn't a colony, it was a territory until very late. And it's absolutely true that there was a sort of space or a need for that to happen, which China, in the basic law kind of blocked and I wasn't happy with. So it's a very muddy area. I don't think it's just a case of Britain zealously introducing democracy. It was much more complicated than that. But my colleagues might have a different view. Anyway, so over to you, Daniel, and then Xin-Fan on the identity issue. Thanks.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much else to add to that. The first part of the fourth question, the crusade for in places like so they can influence the country, the territory, give media support for certain parties. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of that quote unquote crusade for that is, it's a matter of interpretation, of course, and I wouldn't say that they're trying to control it and they're trying to influence, or they're acting kind of like imperialistically, but other people would, obviously. I do think it's about control. I do think it's about power and having a say. I think that part of American identity, of course, again, the official one, so to speak, or its mainstream kind of intellectual culture, is that it is the leader, right? It's the leader. It has a certain, it's the city on the hill thing, shining its light out onto the world. So it has a kind of, all parties, mainstream parties, the major parties, people with power, agree that they should have this role, right? So whether it's a Republican or Democrat, for example, they kind of agree with American leadership in the Pacific, and therefore including in Hong Kong, right? I, myself think that this does more harm than good, although I realize it can be complicated, and maybe there are instances where it has a positive influence or deterrent effect or something like that. It's complex, the world's complex, but I think that in the case of Hong Kong, it's interesting to me in Hong Kong because the protests, all that kind of happened, it really inserted Hong Kong right between China and the United States. And if you know Hong Kong and you're in Hong Kong, the American footprint, I mean, it's there, it's large in a sense because of the power of America globally, but in a way, it's not such a crucial part of Hong Kong, right? I mean, you know what I mean? Like it's not a kind of like de facto territory base or influence, right? I mean, the UK is still more significant in many ways than the US here, right? So, yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but it's partly about control, yeah, and doing what it thinks is good, the good American, so to speak. If you know the old novel Graham Greene. Yeah, next.
Xin-Fan, do you have anything to add to the identity ambivalence of Hong Kongeseness and identification with Chineseness as a subset, or is it something completely different? This is a massive area, so any perspective you want to bring on this?
This is a great question, and I'm sure if you have a chance to read Dan's book, you will learn a lot about this issue, because the book has discussed some aspect of it. And from my point of view, it seems that Hong Kongness is an interesting position and has been a privileged position in between cultures and empires. In other words, on the one hand, if we talk about ethnic composition, right? In terms of ethnicity, Hong Kongese are more Chinese than I am, because I am Manchu. And the local food, right, the local language is very much connected to the Cantonese region, right? So that's quite clear in terms of the cuisine, the culture, the language, and the ethnicity. But at the same time, due to its special position in history, Hong Kong oftentimes was located in between cultures, in between empires, which offers great mobility for the people in that place. That is, if possible, they believe they could choose. They could choose between PRC and Taiwan. They could choose between mainland China and the United Kingdom, or maybe United States, or maybe Singapore, maybe other places. So there's always this belief that this place is free to travel, free to transfer, free to mobilize. And that's what I'm feeling. And the mobility part, the free of choice, it seems to be things that people cherish a lot. And I mentioned the idea of fear. The fear would be, what if that mobility is gone? So I guess that's my general feeling, but not necessarily educated answer. I would really advise you to read Dan's book, because the answers must be there.
I'm not sure the answer's there, but thank you. Yeah.
My commendation. So the final question. So this is the final question again to both of you if you're interested to. Do you see stability as an idol of Hong Kongers and chaos as something that is frowned upon? Say the idea of what being civilized looked like from China's narrative. I presume, Daniel, I mean, this idea that Hong Kongese just love stability, they're apolitical, all this kind of stuff we used to get in the past. I think that's hard to stand by now. I mean, have I got that wrong? I mean, what would you say?
No, I think, I'll make sure I'm on. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And it's not it's not the case. I mean, even before this, Hong Kong had such an active civil society of protest, right? And again, even some of it just non-controversial, like kind of single issue stuff, right? Those kinds of things, right? So and even kind of hope that comes back that way, but that they're apolitical, et cetera, it's just not the case. I mean, it's funny. I mean, having been here since 2006, they're incredibly politicized around this issue of the border and this and that kind of stuff. So I think that's the case. It's not an idol. At the same time, some people were opposed to the protests, right? Even opposed to Occupy or opposed to this and that, or others kind of like, I like it, but don't like all the disruptions to their ability to move around the city and things like that. That's all kind of normal. So kind of the same as everywhere else, but certainly not necessarily enamored of stability. Yeah.
And maybe Xin-Fan, just the final one. So someone has put a question up. Do you think Hong Kong in the next 10 years is just going to become another Chinese city and get eclipsed by Shanghai? So I know you're an historian, you'd like to look at the past, but now I'm going to ask you to peer into the future and tell us what's going to happen.
It's not a fair question to me, but I'll give it a try. I truly believe the success of Hong Kong is because of Hong Kong people. So in other words, let me just bring back the historical perspective, right? In the 1930s, there was this movement saying that we have to do something about the Chinese culture. If we do not save the Chinese culture will be gone. So this is 1930s, right? Because the idea is, look at the world, there are empires, right? Countries like Japan was invading us, and the Chinese civilization was really, in further decline. So we have to find a way to save our culture. And because of that, right, the national government put together this revival Chinese civilization committee or something, right? So there's this movement, political and cultural movement, to revise Chinese civilization through the government intervention. And liberal intellectual Hu Shi, I think most of us know Hu Shi, right? He wrote back and he criticized such behavior, right? Such movement. And he argues Chinese civilization is really Chinese people. As long as Chinese people are here, the civilization is not going to be gone, right? The civilization will be always with us. We don't have to save because we are here, we're the people. I guess the similar argument I can apply to Hong Kong, that is, you have to understand the Hong Kong success, right? The story, the successful story of Hong Kong is not done by anyone else, not by the British, not by the mainlanders, not by the other people, right? It is really done by the local people. The local people work hard. The local people are well educated. They're intelligent. They know how to play games. So because of that, I believe we should worry about anything, right, in this world, because suddenly you just realize anything could go wrong in this world. But at the same time, I guess we have to appreciate the people there. As long as Hong Kong's people are there, I think the city shall remain dynamic, intelligent, creative. It's going to be wonderful. So that's my feeling.
Thank you very much. Well, that was a very upbeat ending. Thank you. It's always good to end on a high note.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I really wanted to thank Daniel for talking about his book, which is out. It's available now, I believe. I'm sure we can send the link for those who. Yeah. I'd like to thank Xin Fan for being an excellent interlocutor and respondent, and for the people who attended in the audience. Ah, yes.
Thank you. There you go. There it is.
There it is. This is recorded, so it will be available online. We'll send it obviously to other people once we've kind of downloaded it. But thank you very much. Thank you both for great discussion, and particularly
thank you, Xin. Thanks so much
about the book.
Thank you, Dan. For
you take care, everyone. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks
a lot. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.